Today I'm starting a 2-sermon series on You Are What You Love. And I'll just tell you, I mentioned this in my column, in the kind of the PS that I do to my column. I read a book at the beach called You Are What You Love. And it's a book that's very relevant, I think accessible to lay people. So next week I'm going to talk a bit about the book, and we'll put it up there for you. Put a copy of it if you want to order the book. Today's kind of the sermon that introduces that book. And so I'm going to invite you to turn with me to the Gospel of Mark. You know, I always say the Gospel of Mark, if you want to start reading the New Testament, start with Mark. It's the shortest gospel by far. It was the first one written, the earliest one written, and it gets right into it. There's no Christmas story. I know you love the Christmas story in Luke and Matthew, but in Mark it just moves right on through. So by the middle of Mark, Jesus is right there in the middle of his teaching ministry. And so that's where we're going to pick it up today with verse 21 of the first chapter of Mark. They went to Capernaum, and when the Sabbath came, Jesus entered the synagogue and taught. They were astounded at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority and not as the scribes. Just then there was in their synagogue a man with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." But Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be silent and come out of him." And the unclean spirit, convulsing him and crying with a loud voice, came out of him. They were all amazed, and they kept asking one another, "What is this? A new teaching with authority. He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him." And at once his fame began to spread throughout the surrounding region of Galilee. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. This is a story about how a guy named Donald saved our 5-day beach vacation. It's a long story, and I could bore you a lot with all the details leading up to this moment, but I'll just kind of pick up the story if you can get the picture here. Saturday afternoon, 3 o'clock, Saturday afternoon, Mobile, Alabama. Bobby and I are on the way to Orange Beach, Gulf Shores, Alabama, and we have 2 grandchildren with us, a 6-year-old and a 10-year-old, and we have discovered that we have a leaking front right tire. Now just picture this for a moment, if you will. I've been to several big tire stores, been to a Super Walmart, been to a Discount Tire, been to, Pep Boys, and all of them say, "We can't get to your tire today, or it's going to be a couple or 3 hours. We're just not sure." And so this is what I'm facing. I know I'm not about to drive a tire like that under Mobile Bay, through the tunnel under Mobile Bay. And so I know that if we don't get that tire fixed by 5 o'clock that afternoon, we're going to end up spending Saturday night and Sunday night in Mobile, Alabama, 2 extra motel rooms, missed 2/5 of our vacation at Gulf Shores, and all of it with a 6-year-old and a 10-year-old, right? So I'm pretty panicked. The last big store we pull up to, the guy says, "Look, I just can't get to it, but why don't you take it to L&M Tire Repair? They can probably get to it." I said, "Okay, I will. Where is L&M?" 2 blocks that way. You see that McDonald's there? Just go over to the street over there on that other side, and you'll see them. I got in the car, we drove around there, and when I pulled up to L&M, this is a place like no other tire repair or tire store you've ever seen before. It was really just a great big shed. There was a roof and there were walls, but there were no on the side. But it was just a shed. It was like an open garage. And there were about 4 or 5 entries into that shed, and everybody's in there changing tires. And I pulled up there, and there was no office except there was a little white frame office attached to it, and that was it. So I pulled up, and one of the guys came up to me. I said, "What do I need to do to get the paperwork started? I've got a tire that needs to be fixed." He says, "Oh, we don't have paperwork around here. Just pull around there and get in line." So I did. I got in line and I kept thinking, I don't know about this. But we only waited about 20 or 25 minutes, and the cars in front of us, they were changing those tires just like that. And finally, this guy named Donald came out. He had his name on his overalls, his coveralls. He comes out and he motions us forward, and he says, "What you got?" Now, Donald was about, I'm guessing 55, 56 years old, about 5'9" or 5'10", 160 pounds. And he had a cigarette drooping from his lip. And he looks at me and he says, "What you got?" And I immediately loved this man. I loved him because I knew precisely who he was. I worked with men like this in the oil fields around Wichita Falls. I've worked with guys like this on the ranches of West Texas. My father-in-law, Bill Thompson, was a welder. He was a guy like this. Bill Thompson was one of these people that the men who worked with him, they were all men, would say, "Bill Thompson has forgotten more about welding than all the other men will know put together." I don't know how you can spot them. Somehow you just look at these guys and you know they're the ones who know how to get the job done. I'll give you a little experiment. You probably never thought about this, but next time you're out on the toll road or 75 or on 380, wherever it is you drive, it doesn't take long in Dallas these days. You're going to come upon a construction project on the side of the road. And I'm not talking about having some flagmen out there kind of doing a little bit. If it's a real construction project and you're stuck there, you're getting frustrated, it's hot, you're waiting. Spend your time looking at the crew members, and you will spot this person every time. I don't know how it is that you do, but you will just know him when you see him. It's kind of a sexist example, but they're usually men. You'll know him when you see him. You just can tell by the look of his face, this is the guy who has forgotten more about how to do this than all the rest of them put together. When they get into trouble, that's who they go to. When they have some kind of a hiccup in the job, even the foreman will go to this guy and say, "What do we do now?" I looked at Donald and I knew that he had forgotten more about how to repair a flat tire than most men will ever know. So I said, "We got a flat tire right front. It's leaking slowly." He took that tire, he pulled it off of there in about 2 minutes. Even though this was a very, very modest building, if that's what you want to call it, they had a great equipment. So he pumped at that tire in about 45 minutes. He took it over and he dropped it in a big barrel of water. And there was a hydraulic piston, kind of. And he hit the button on that and it pushed that tire down into the water. And after a few minutes, you could see the bubbles coming out. He pulled that tire out of there. He said, "There's your leak." And I was immediately disheartened. It was in the sidewall. I said, "Well, it's in the sidewall. You can't fix it, can you?" He said, "I can." And I believed him. He said, $25, it's better than replacing a $250 Mitchell. And I said, "Go after it." And so I watched him. I followed him every step of the way. He pulled that tire off of there. He fixed it the old-fashioned way. I can remember seeing people fix tires like that 50 years ago. He patched it. He turned to me. He could tell I was a little bit worried. He said, "I promise you, this tire will go completely bald before this patch comes off of here." And I knew he was telling me the truth. He put the tire back on the car. I said, "Where's my paperwork? Where do I go to pay?" He said, "Just follow me. There's no paperwork." So I followed him into that little shack of an office. There was a woman sitting behind a great big desk, and he went up to her. He said, "Flat tire, $25. I pulled out my money clip. I handed her $25. "That's it?" She said, "That's it." Donald and I walked out together. As we walked out, I peeled off a $20 bill and I gave it to him. I said, "Donald, I don't know what you do on Saturday night, but whatever you do on Saturday nights, now you can do a little bit more of it." I don't know why I said that to him. I just, it just seemed like the Christian thing to say at the time. I was thinking, I'm pretty sure he was going to take his mother out to dinner, or to the movies. or something. That's how a guy named Donald saved our beach vacation. If you're ever in Mobile, Alabama, drive by L&M Tire Repair and do homage. That morning when Jesus walked down the center aisle of the synagogue, all eyes were on him. And there was something about this man, the way he looked, the way he carried himself. There was something about this man, they knew that something extraordinary was about to happen. He was wearing the clothes of a working man. He wasn't wearing a robe. He wasn't sporting a stole. He didn't have a degree in theology. He hadn't been consecrated or ordained. He hadn't even been hired. He wasn't a scribe. He wasn't a Pharisee. He wasn't a Sadducee. But there was just something about this man. When they looked at him as he walked down the center aisle, they knew that somehow this man knew something about God that they did not. And then he mounted the pulpit. And he took the scrolls that held the Hebrew Scripture. And he gently unrolled them. And he began to read. And they looked at one another and they said, "What is this? Here is one who speaks with authority. This is a man who lives so close to God that he knows more about God than all of our other teachers put together." It is just a remarkable scene. If you'll use your imagination, it is a remarkable moment right here at the beginning of the ministry of Jesus. And when I myself think about Jesus walking down that aisle and picking up the scrolls and unrolling them, the Hebrew Scriptures, the sacred Scriptures, I always think of what the German-American theologian Paul Tillich said about reading the Bible. He said, there are two ways of reading the Bible. He was talking about preachers for the most part, but not exclusively. He said there are two ways of reading the Bible. One way is by holding the Bible. He said there are some people who grab the Bible and they hold the Bible and they use the Bible. They use the Bible to make a point. They use the Bible to win a point. They use the Bible sometimes as a tool, sometimes as a weapon, to prove that they are right and that everybody else is wrong. And then he said there's another way of reading the Bible. And he said that is, there are those who open the Bible and rather than holding it, they are held by the Bible, by the Holy Scriptures. And when they read, what you hear is something profound and mysterious and deep. I will tell you that I've come to believe in my old age. I used to think when I was younger, I thought if I just keep reading the Bible, maybe I will understand more and more and more of it. And there is a sense in which that has happened. I mean, if you keep doing it over and over again, you begin to understand more and more of it. But what I've also come to understand in my old age is that the more you understand about the Bible, the more you understand that there is a deep mystery, there is something profound about the Bible that you will never, ever fully understand. So when we read the Bible, whether we're reading for ourselves or somebody else, I think the person who says, I've got it, I understand it, they don't understand it at all, because there is a truth and mystery and a wisdom that is so profound that we can't completely understand it. The best we can do is to hold it and allow it to hold us. I think that's what Jesus was doing that day. He unrolls the scrolls, and somehow they can tell that the remarkable love this man has for Scripture, for the wisdom. And they turn to one another and they say, such authority as this we have never seen. Here's a man who knows more about God than all our other teachers combined. And then all of a sudden, all hell breaks loose. This man in the congregation, he jumps up and he begins screaming, and there's chaos. And he says, I know who you are, Jesus. The simplicity and the authenticity of Jesus as a child of God was too much for this man. He says, I know who you are, Jesus. You have come to destroy us. And of course, we know what they thought. They thought this was a man that was possessed by demons. Today, we would just say that this is a man who had a psychosis of some kind of mental illness. It really doesn't make any difference, does it? What we know is that Jesus walked up and looked at the man in the eye and he said, come out of him. And whatever it was, the anger, the rage, the confusion, whatever it was that was destroying this man's life, came out of him. And there was peace. And the people looked at one another and they said, what is this? A kind of authority and love for God that we have never seen before. I'll tell you how I think about the healing miracles of Jesus in my old age. I confess that I've always been befuddled by them. And I'll tell you why. We have so many ailments these days. I'm just going to deal with the one that we read about here, mental illness. I've talked about mental illness before. We have so much mental illness of one kind or another in our society, beginning with depression and anxiety and going through suicide, a rising rate of suicide, especially amongst middle-aged men, an addiction, the opioid crisis, and it seems to be rising, and we have fewer and fewer resources to deal with mental illness. And families, all of you, every family has been touched in one way or the other by some kind of mental illness. And it can be so difficult and frustrating. And so it's always been befuddling to me. You turn to the New Testament and you see Jesus, and he's walking through the four Gospels. And Jesus walked along. Here's a blind man. He touches him, he heals him, and his eyesight comes back. Here's a man that's paralyzed, and he touches him, and all of a sudden he's healed. Somebody with leprosy, their skin is cleared. Here's the person with psychosis, and Jesus says, come out, come out. And suddenly the man is at peace. He has a life of hopefulness again. And I don't know about you, but as I've read that through the years, I think it just looks like it's saying that Jesus wants all of these ailments to be healed. So why is it that we have so much today? Why was it that Jesus wanted everybody to be healed back then and not today? But in my old age, I think I've come to understand that all these stories about Jesus confronting people who were blind, or who were paralyzed, or who were mentally ill, all of these stories are really just stories about a person's brokenness. A person's brokenness. It's about the confrontation between Jesus and someone who is broken. Sometimes a person is broken and you can see it on the outside. They're blind, they can't see, or they're paralyzed, they can't move. Other times people are broken, but you can't see it. They suffer from a broken heart, a lost relationship, or someone who has died and they're grieving, the sadness is overcoming them. Or a broken spirit, somehow life has just sucked it all out of them. Sometimes it's a person who's made a ton of money, is successful and powerful, and yet after accomplishing all of that, they realize they're still empty on the inside and they are broken on the inside. A broken body, a broken heart, a broken spirit. It doesn't make any difference. Sometimes we can see the brokenness, sometimes we can't. But when you stop and think about it, we are all broken. At least at one time or another, we know there is a part of us that is broken. And so when we see these healing miracles of Jesus, I think I've come to understand that it's telling us nothing more that Jesus is the one who heals our brokenness. Every one of us. And so the people that were gathered around that day, and they see this man yelling at Jesus, and they see Jesus say, "Come out of him," and all of a sudden there is peace. And they said, a teaching like this, an authority like this, we've never seen. Maybe some of them, maybe all of them at first said, he's not like us, he's not like us, he's broken, you can see it. But maybe if they kept thinking about it, maybe if they kept thinking about it, they said, he's broken on the outside, but I think maybe there's a brokenness on the inside of me. Maybe Jesus could heal my brokenness, my broken heart, my spirit, which has been broken. The healing miracles just tell us that we all need Jesus, don't they? And so they're thinking, such authority as this, we've never seen authority like this. A man who is so close to God that he is like God. And you wonder, what is the source of this kind of spiritual authority? Well, every once in a while, you'll pick up a scripture and you'll have a beginning and an ending, and you'll read it and you're trying to figure it out. And sometimes you just need to keep reading. So that's what takes place here. If you keep reading, you'll read about him going to the home of Simon Peter's mother and healing her of an illness. And then you can pick it up. We'll put it here on the screen for you. Verse 32. This is the way it goes. Just a few verses later. It says, that evening at sundown, they brought to him all who were sick or possessed with demons. And the whole city was gathered around the door. And he cured many who were sick with various diseases and cast out many demons. And he would not permit the demons to speak because they knew him. And this remarkable verse, in the morning, while it was still very dark, he got up and went out to a deserted place. And there he prayed. We read that on multiple occasions throughout the New Testament. He got up early in the morning. He went out to a dark and deserted place. And there he prayed. And that was the source of his power. I have to tell you that after 46 years in ministry, I still don't know very much about prayer. I've written a book about prayer. I've written a book about the prayer that Jesus taught, the Lord's Prayer. And while I was writing that book, I learned so much. I mean, I've learned a little bit about prayer. And yet I realize that when it comes to the way in which Jesus prayed, I still do not understand very much about prayer. But this much I think I understand from the times when you read through the New Testament. I think I understand this much about the way in which Jesus prayed. He sat in the presence of God long enough that he finished his little list of prayer requests the way you and I think about prayer. We know he made requests of God because on the Mount of Olives on the last night, he said, "Dear God, let this cup pass from me." So we know he didn't hesitate to ask God. But I think that was just the beginning, probably. He sat in the presence of God until he moved past that, and he stopped asking God for things, and he started listening for what God wanted from him. And then he continued to sit in the presence of God until there came this point that there was no transaction at all. He was just in the presence of God, and he realized that God was loving him. And then he remained until there came that moment when he knew he was loving God. I think he stayed and prayed until he knew he was loving God. And he became what he loved. He became love. I wonder if that could happen for you or me.